Overnight, Russia admitted that Ukrainian drones struck the Afipsky oil refinery in Krasnodar, Russia. That is a fuel node hit, and any fuel node hit means that the war is going to slow down. Russia could pretend that everything is fine, that nothing has changed. However, armies do in fact run on fuel, not on empty words. And what we're seeing today, though, is something even more important, is that three epic failures are stacking up at the very same time. We see that fuel is getting tighter. That means that rotations will cost more. We see that the 2026 budget is getting even tighter than that. And every repair will steal money that provides for the domestic calm. But last, we see that the aviation fleet within Russia is getting thinner. Russia keeps flying by stripping parts and reviving old airframes. So is it by coincidence that Russia today loves to suddenly talk about talks, negotiations? No, it is not. There's a reason for that, though. It's because talks cost nothing. Repairs, they cost money. And so Russia today is trying to figure out how to keep alive, how to continue fighting. But Russia is essentially out of options. Because when Russia starts cannibalizing its own aviation fleet, the war is no longer in Ukraine. The war is inside of Russia. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a national security advisor and Kyiv Post special correspondent. If you want briefs on what is really happening and not just the headlines, please subscribe now and consider becoming a channel member. Thank you. So the Afipsky oil refinery had a capacity of about 6.3 million tons per year. That works out to 125,000 barrels per day. This facility was producing diesel and jet fuel for southern Russia. It was critical, in fact, to help move the trucks, the armor, but today it won't be able to do that. Today it will not be able to supply the jet fuel needed by the Russian military. And the refinery hit forces difficult decisions on Moscow. At that point, Russia must decide. Will the civilians be protected from this? Will they be able to afford gas at the pump? Will there be regional calm? Or will the military get the supply? Will it be given to them to guarantee rotation tempo and frontline resupply? And only one of those can get it, you can be sure. It won't be the civilians of Russia. Obviously, Vladimir Putin is not worried about the common Russian. He doesn't care what they think. Up until the moment, they become envious. Up until the moment, they realize that the Putin regime is costing them too much. Consider this. It's estimated that many of these repairs can cost about $100 million or more to the oil refineries. Now, how much is that for the average Russian? Well, the average Russian cannot imagine numbers so big. Quite literally, cannot imagine. Imagine a typical worker makes about $12,700 a year, or the average teacher makes about $7,700 a year. The average doctor, $8,700 a year. That's $11,500 full annual salaries for a doctor. How can you imagine that today Russia's losing that much in just one strike? But even worse than that, to add insult to injury, is that the strikes are often done with drones that are expensive, but they cost about $200,000. That means that one attack for $200,000, it has a return on investment of 500 to 1. And that is incredible capital asymmetry. And that is before we count the downtime, the spare parts, the emergency trucking, the air defense launches. So in real terms, how effective have Ukraine's attacks on Russia's oil industry been? How much real damage have they done? Well, aside from all the time lost and the opportunity cost, there's something else that's very important. The estimated cost to fix all these different refineries works out to be about $12 to $25 billion. Now, for a country that's already in the hole for $46 billion, that's a lot of extra money to add. And Ukraine is not slowing down. And that's the key here. Ukraine understands this is the only way for it to win. It needs a paradigm shift. It needs the ability to put Russia on its toes, to make sure that it's Russia that is not driving the future of this war. As soon as Russia is given agency in that, as soon as Russia believes that it can dictate the terms of this war, Ukraine is done. Ukraine must make sure that Russia is not able to do that. And that's why attacks within Russia is the best way to achieve it. Now, for Vladimir Putin himself, what does he see when he looks at this? Well, first, we can be pretty sure he doesn't realize how bad it's really become. He doesn't understand the disaster their airline industry is in, for instance. Did you know that today Russia has about 700 Western-made Airbus and Boeing aircraft? Now, the sanctions have emptied out that fleet. It's become a maintenance trap. They keep their routes alive by stripping parts from some planes and then flying the other planes. But that trick works while there's still donor airplanes. But today, it's running out of donor airplanes. Russia today is desperate, though, to find a workaround. What can it do when it doesn't have more donor airplanes? And that's why they're bringing out the mothballed Tupolev 204s and the Ilyushin 96 aircrafts. Bringing them back to part of your fleet is pretty strange. It's pretty archaic, but it's more than that. Older airframes require more maintenance hours per flight hour and deliver lower scheduled reliability. Now, for Russia, when you're considering higher cost, which this will be, how do you do that when you don't have money? How do you keep it going when you realize you don't have the financial means to keep the show on the road? And that's why Russia today is talking about negotiations. And it's funny how they do that, though. And it's worth noting. It is exactly the same strategy they used during the Cold War. We saw during the SALT treaties how they behaved. And in fact, Herb Cohen wrote about it more than 40 years ago. You've seen that when you're watching the Russians, always look for the first thing they do. They set maximalist demands. And they say things that they know cannot be reached. But the idea is to anchor the conversation in that, to make that the center. Russians say they want Ukraine to surrender, to capitulate, to give up territory. And if you start with that point, that makes that the norm. And then they work back from there. But the most important thing is this. The Russians, they're not interested in making a peace deal. They're interested in buying time. They're interested in stringing along those who believe they want peace, because they realize their best bet for getting what they want is to have a paradigm shift. But in the case of Russia, they can't afford to have a paradigm shift like the one that Ukraine has. Ukraine's striking within Russia, destroying the oil industry that cuts off the money for the country. When there's no more money, it's very hard to run your country. But Ukraine being attacked by Russia is totally different. They're not the same. The attacks within Ukraine are horrific. And in fact, most people are most of the time sitting in the dark with no electricity, no hot water, and no heating. But yet, the Ukrainians wish to continue fighting. You do not see any protest anywhere with people demanding an end to the war. They are sacrificing themselves to make sure that Ukraine wins. We can be sure that the Russian side would not do that. We've seen in Russia that there's not a lot of demand for continuous war. It is something that Vladimir Putin feels he must do, but it's something that he cannot afford to do. But there is another factor, another game changer that is at play, and it's not being done by Ukraine nor by Russia. It's coming from a third source, but it equally affects how this is all occurring. Vladimir Putin, as we've discussed, is quite a paranoid individual. He's scared of everything. He rarely goes in public. He probably only meets with 3 to 5 people a day. And because he doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have a computer, he doesn't watch television, he only knows what his aides tell him. So today, how can his aides explain to him that they're flying dinosaurs? That today their budget is in the red? How can they explain another oil refinery was hit? They can't. But there is some news that Vladimir Putin does get, such as what happened to Nicolas Maduro. Now, of course, that concerned him. That worried him. That's his ally. He's aware of what's happening in Iran. There are large protests, and the regime there was so close to falling. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin, that makes you nervous. You also, though, cannot believe this is all happening by chance. You can't believe that the Iranians really would protest against their government. It must be the hands of the Americans. That is what the Russians often believe about anything that happens. But that's where it gets very interesting to see what the New York Times just came out with, saying that the American government, the White House, is interested in toppling the regime in Cuba before the end of the year. Now, for Vladimir Putin to look at all these coincidences, what's happening in Iran, what is happening inside of Venezuela, what is happening in Cuba, he comes to his own conclusions, and we can be sure that conclusion is that the United States is actively going after all of its enemies. And he knows very well that he has not behaved very well recently, that he is not taking these negotiations seriously, that he, in fact, is stringing everyone along. And that's why he knows he should be worried. And how we see that manifested is some of the things that Putin has done recently. We see that Vladimir Putin is taking a very low profile. He essentially has stopped going to Moscow. He spends most of the time in a town called Valdai. Now, sitting up in Valdai, far away from the rest of the world, he has a lot of time to think. And living in total isolation, there's nobody to correct his thoughts. And that's why Vladimir Putin today is behaving more erratically. In fact, we haven't essentially seen him since New Year's. Now, there's videos that have come out, but a lot of people say it might not be the real Putin. Is that possible? Most certainly the case. In fact, several foreign intelligence services, including the one in Britain, have said from former people that worked in the Russia case that Putin undoubtedly is using body doubles. Now, those seems completely fanciful. It seems sort of off the wall here in the West. For Russia, it's totally normal. Deception is part of negotiation. Deception is part of life. But that deception counts in everything. That's why even though today you would think that Vladimir Putin might be happy with some of the things he sees in negotiations, he's not. He still fears, because he doesn't believe that anybody can truly be your friend, that everybody is somehow complicit in your impending downfall. You have to catch who they are. But that's why he himself is the one responsible for every problem that he's gotten himself into. Look what we see going on with the intelligence services. They're cracking down on the people in the military. It is not just that today they realize they cannot trust those around them. It's something more. It's that they realize that this regime won't last forever. The Putin regime today is very weak. It's structurally not sound. And Vladimir Putin himself is becoming detached from what is occurring. He is not clear. He does not understand how bad his situation has become. He still thinks that Russia can negotiate with strength. But looking at the recent numbers, looking at their amazing losses, the over 1.2 million soldiers killed or injured since the beginning of this war, it's quite obvious there is no way for him to win. In fact, let's call this the Ceausescu path. Now, you recall how Ceausescu, the late dictator of Romania, ended. It was not a happy day for him or the missus, but that came quite suddenly. He had expected they had total control in the country. He had attended a protest just a couple days before, and the workers started to boo him. That was the first time that it ever occurred to him. That was the first time he'd ever thought the people were really against him. But Vladimir Putin's having his own moments like that. Today, we see in Russia that more people are leaving. We see inside of Russia that those in the oligarchy are becoming dissatisfied. They're unhappy with the fact their money is disappearing. They're being taxed more, and now the government is freezing many accounts. That today, the government is actively working against them. They get more liquidity, get more cash to continue fighting a war. So when they do these calculations themselves, what this war is costing, how much an oil refinery costs when it's lost, they come to a conclusion. Maybe Vladimir Putin needs to stop taking a risk with my money. And that's where Putin gets into a problem. That is exactly where dictatorships like his begin to fall. It's when all of a sudden it becomes apparent to everybody that we don't really need you. You are superfluous. We'd be better off without you. Because an old dictator, no longer needed, has no place to go. Who would need him? Vladimir Putin is in a very difficult situation. And it's a situation, though, that fortunately is about to get much worse. Thank you for supporting Ukraine.